Is it,
All right, perfect. Okay. I'm going to
is
set up
that
a
a
fail safe.
is that a university student's residence?
No, no, it's just a rental.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. Voice recording. I am setting up a voice recording as well, just in case the original Zoom recording isn't going to work, just in case. I
okay.
am making sure this, making sure I don't have to call you again to be like, hey, can we go through all the questions one more time? That's
So after this is done, if it all goes well, then you, between meeting me and talking to me and the emails and this, you've done all the interviewing you need to do your write up.
yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully, yes. Can hopefully everybody else in the class has no problem with their alumni interviews because this whole project is it's essential that everyone has interviewed someone and that we have enough data and enough people
Right.
contributing. Um, so yeah.
And do the alumni that are interviewed get a copy of the final result?
I asked my prof, and turns out the data that we'll be publishing will be accessible to the public.
Okay,
So
good.
once we have it out and published, I will, if you'd like, I can send you a link and send you the information for it.
Okay. And
Yeah.
that's supposed to be done this year?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Okay. Let us get started. Okay.
Can I have my juice while we're talking?
Yes, of
Can
course.
I have my juice while we're talking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So section one is on popular culture. Um, so cultural historians have argued that television, Hollywood, popular music, and a consumer culture built around automobiles created a more integrated North American popular culture. Ottawa was a bilingual institution, and we want to better understand how Anglophones and Francophones related together. So, our first question is: there were less electronics in Canadian society during the 1970s. How was your leisure time scheduled, or what did you Ottawa students do for fun in the 1970s?
Well, apart from all the drinking, it was rampant. Well, even among the some of the professors and the dean, but that seemed to be a pretty prevalent theme throughout law school is the drinking and too often intoxication. I mean, there was one night when one of our students, friends, or colleagues decided to photocopy his bum. It sat on the photocopy machine. He had to go to the hospital. I mean, that's an extreme thing, but that's something I do remember is that even driving back and forth, some of us were coming in from out of town, Prescott, and people were, I mean, these are law students still drinking and driving. So the kind of conduct was not as great as it should have been. And that related to interrelationships. Uh, so those were not, I mean, it's like it was like they were like the 70s hippies, but we were law students. But it was like, it was a way to deal with the stress of the law school because it was very stressful. I think I told you about getting into law school. There was over 1,000 applicants. They only picked just about 100. And the first day, the dean put 10 of us each in his office. Didn't say congratulations. He said, look around. 40% of you won't be here next year. And then he said, handed an article that good law school flunks 40% of its students. He said, even if you make it the second, third year. So there's a lot of pressure, very strict pressure. But at the end of the day, after many years, and we only ended up with 65 people from 100 and some. Um, People said, well, we got prepared for the tough, he always said, we're getting you prepared for a tough profession. So that, uh, it was a kind of environment I'm not expecting and I'm not used to. But to use your word, we thought it was fun. It was a way to, deal with everything. And there was no leeway given in terms of exams or papers. Everything had to be on time and you can. And there was no like Christmas exams, 100%. In those days, 100% of your grade was the last exam, and it was an open exam. You can bring stuff in, but you're looking over your shoulder. So I think, in reflection, it was a very stressful environment, and it was always great to feel that you made it to the next year and you didn't know it was gone and on and on. And then you see people, some people had heart attacks under stress. There was one woman in particular, she had a BA, a master's degree, A++, and she didn't make it, and she became, she kind of fell apart. So I saw a lot of damaged goods, but the ones we did enjoy, and I always joked my way through law school, so I was joking in class, and that's how we made it through. So I don't know if that answers your question in any part, but that was what comes to me when you ask that. And there was not a lot of electronics, it's true. And we had one guy in particular that became the walking genius, so we all had lined up to ask him questions, and we did a lot of, that's one thing we did do. We had study groups that were really good. We actually efficiently met for study groups and learned from each other. We had to stay on top of the materials.
Okay, perfect. That was a great answer. Exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay, great.
I have some follow-up questions for this theme. If you have any information on these little questions, they're a little more specific. That'd be awesome. Okay. What were the most popular hangout spots on and off campus?
What were the most popular what?
Hangout spots. Where would you spend?
Oh, hangout spots.
Yeah.
Oh, well, let me think. Well, definitely the local bars. I think you're jogging my memory, but I do believe we did enjoy the library. Like, we found the library is very quiet. We can do our research there. People were not allowed to speak out, so you knew you could have focus time. So I remember how much time we spent in the libraries. Often we were together, and if we could go to a place where we could pass notes or whatever, but we would do research together. We would make sure that the required readings were all done up, and sometimes there was optional readings. Sometimes we would use our spots to, like, if there was a lot of reading to be done, we would take turns reading certain things and then debrief the others in terms of everybody reading one thing. So we developed a very collective group. I think we had about 5 students or more in each group. And so that was when I think of that library, I mean, to me, it was my second home. I loved the library. I love books. I wanted to be a librarian, not a lawyer, but anyway, that's another story. Other spots, we would go try to do some group outings like theater or play, or, we tried to socialize as a group, and some of us got to know others better. Some of us stayed away from certain people because they would want to do things that were not appropriate. And then other spots, well, I was very much into the spiritual realm. I always have been. So, some of us would go to spiritual places together. I like to go to all the different places, mosques, synagogues, where Buddhists and Hindus meet, Christians, Jews. So going to those spots when I'm on recollection, I tried once a week to try to get some people to go to a different place, because they're all governed by laws, canon law. There's common law, there's civil law, there's Sharia law, but there's also the canon law. So it's good to get to know how religions see the law. And as Shakespeare wrote, if religious canons be cruel, what should war be? So that was another thing that comes to mind.
Okay, perfect. Ottawa was a bilingual institution. How linguistically integrated was it in the 1970s? Did Francophones and Anglophones enroll in the same courses and participate in the same clubs?
It's a great question. My recollection is people couldn't, in those days, I can remember we were the first law school at Full Hall, 1971. That's when it opened. So we have that, and we're doing our 50th anniversary next year. So you can always do everything in English. People with French, I think in those days they can ask for some French, but I don't remember that the faculty were fully bilingual. I don't remember that being the case. So I think that was a factor. But I always believe the only language in the world that counts is the language of love. And the idea of these verbal languages, like we can get too trapped in words. We should work from our heart. And I guess somebody said maybe I got involved with the law to try to bring some humanization to it, but trying to bring the language of love into the legal profession and law school was an objective of mine, and we would have conversations around that. So the linguistic part does not stand out as a big issue. It's not an obstacle, and it wasn't required. But it was in the air, though, for sure. There was a lot of sensitivity around ensuring the respect for the French language because it's a bilingual university.
Okay. What did the student body think about the Vietnam War?
Well, I would say, in general, all of that generation were against the war. I can't imagine. When you look back in history and you look at the protests now that are going on, especially with the social media, and a lot of the Hare Krishna people and all the draft dodgers and all the cases of people trying to get excused from the war for conscious objectors, that was a part that I found intriguing about the famous cases where people go to be conscious objectors and they were ridiculed if they wanted to avoid service. But and those issues prevail today. But I would say, by and large, the attitude of university students everywhere was against that kind of intervention for a lot of reasons, not just political and intellectual and philosophical, but it's about military and somebody else controlling your life. And it didn't seem to be sensible or fair that somebody can require you to go kill another human being. But war is necessary, sometimes very much necessary. It's killing is not a problem, it's murder. And so killing is usually justified to protect your family and your property and your nation, which we have done in history and is still being done. But that war did not resonate, I don't think, with that generation.
All right. I think I have two more questions for this section, and then we can move on to the next. The first question is, rock and roll artists in the 1960s had promoted various forms of protest. Did your parents see rock and roll as rebellious or just a form of popular music?
They didn't comprehend it. I don't even think they even tried to figure out what it was. So it was like a foreign language. So there was not like a dialogue around it. It was just something that they didn't want to learn that language. And we spoke that language, and they said, it's fine with you. Don't bother us with that. We're too old to learn a new language. So I don't think there was a real generational divide on that.
All right. And this last one, if you don't feel comfortable answering this one, you don't have to speak of your personal experience or anything, but the question is, some youth culture voices of the 1970s promoted taking recreational drugs. To what extent were recreational drugs available on campus?
Too much. By the way, I told you at our last discussion, there's never a last question, there's only the next one. Drugs, I never partook in them. There was one night somebody asked me to try it out, and apparently it was very funny for the rest of the night. I don't quite remember. Somebody was giving me cookies because I couldn't smoke. I tried, but I just could not relate to that. But I found that on campus, that was pretty prevalent, openly or secretly, or so I could not relate to that. And there were a lot of parties to go to, and there was more drugs than alcohol. And sometimes I had trouble because I was inhaling it. But people seemed to open up more when they were on drugs. They seemed to be able to get stuff out. And so I was always sober in that regard. So I became an active listener. So I learned a lot.
That's
And
awesome.
people bore their souls a lot, about their frustrations or their concerns. And so it seemed to be a necessary ingredient for some people to get through.
All right, thank you. Okay, our second section is the female experience. So the opening statement / question is, cultural historians have written a lot about what they call second wave feminism, that as part of the counterculture movement, women during the early 70s sought to break down gender barriers. Does this argument resonate with your experience on the U Ottawa campus in the early 1970s?
Oh, for sure. It's a great question. Whoever drafted these questions knows what they're talking about.
I
One of
helped
the
draft these questions.
Oh, very good. Um, one of the things that struck all of us was out of 1,000+ applicants, the majority were men. There was still quite a bit of women. We didn't know the exact number. It was quite a few. But of the 100 and some that were accepted, and when you look at the end of the day, of the 65 graduates, there was only 5 women. Now you compare that to today, there's over 50%, as I know, in law school that are women. And that was a kind of a tension. At the time, it was always considered to be, I think, a male-dominated profession from the time it got started in the 18th century and was brought over here from England. But I don't think women, were considered to be the right gender for law school and judges. I mean, the first female judge in Canada was in the early 1980s, late 1970s, Justice Rosalie Abella, who became a judge of the Court of Appeal and a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada. I've talked to you about her. She's been a phenomenal supporter of social justice, but she and other women like her, they did breakthroughs in Canada. I think that helped because if you look at her career, in fact, when she was under 30, I think, and she was pregnant too. So that made it really unique in Canadian history. But you have the women like that and other women in the profession did make some breakthroughs, and that started around that time. So Justice Abella, if you look at her incredible career, and she wrote the 1984 report on equality for everybody, including disabled people, people of color, and so on. So I think at that time frame, your cultural historians should look at the women that made those strides. It was like the suffragette movement. There were women well known for making sure the women can vote. There were women back then in the late 70s, 80s, or early in the 70s when we were there, who were making breakthroughs, including into the faculty and other positions in society. So I would kind of add that to the mix of some study about that, and definitely put Justice Rosalie Abella at the top of the list.
All right.
They were inspiring, I think, to the women in our class. It's inspiring to see women get into these positions. And
all right. A follow-up question. In your own words, what did feminism signify in Canada during the early 70s?
well, I guess I saw that phrase as an evolution of thinking. The woman that came up with that phrase, her name escapes me, but she ended up ridiculing the third wave of feminism and so on. So it was kind of a split within the movement about that. And it kind of, although it was trying to do an integration concept and equality, it actually created a lot of divisions. And I found a lot of conflict. We're not, equal and all the rest of it. So the woman that wrote the book and started all, she ended up being ostracized by the feminist movement because she found it went too far. And it was not integrating thinking with other, not just male sectors, but other sectors of society. So, but at that time, it was in that, you call it the second wave. It went to a third wave and fourth wave, and then it got taken over by a group. That's what I understand. But in those days, my recollection is it was appreciated that that topic was being considered. I mean, I was getting involved with disability issues, and there's a lot of issues around what Justice Avella wrote in the 1984 very historic document in Canada. It actually was accepted around Canada and other common law countries about a breakthrough of disadvantaged people when women were considered in that group. So you got to look at it in the bigger context when you look at that, the history. So I think that's we were at the beginning. It was quite exciting, though, to see it evolve.
Okay. Gender distinctions were more pronounced in the 1970s than today. How did being a woman result in different treatment and expectations in classrooms or at social events compared to male students?
Well, the expectations, sadly, was not just about in the classrooms, but in the bedrooms. So that, to me, was very disheartening. And I dare to say there were a couple of women that made themselves available, and that didn't help. I mean, it was like, I mean, that part of that part of the experience was not that comfortable. There was, even with married people, there was like, you're here in your law school, and a lot of them were not, at their homes. So I think that part of the human journey was not well respected as much as it should have been. So that part of the law school experience did not sit well with me. But I guess there was a lot of pressure on certain women to do certain things, and most of them kept their integrity. But there was sort of expectations that were very male orientated that still prevailed, I think. So that was a challenge for sure. And I think it's now, those are the old days, but that in that time it was some tension around that.
Right. In the 1970s, were there U Ottawa programs, departments, or clubs where women were less present and accepted?
Can you repeat the beginning of that? In the 1970s, what?
In the 1970s, were there U Ottawa programs, departments, or clubs where women were less present and accepted than others?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I would say it was not official that they were not accepted. But I remember going to a number of events where there was an impression left that you're not welcome. It was kind of going to be an all males, technically the door was open to women, but the signal was you're not welcome. And I didn't like that part either. And some women actually tried to crash some events because they thought that was unacceptable. So that created some interesting evenings. There was one in particular, they were trying to convince this woman not to come. She said, well, I'm a member of the university, I'm going to law school, why can't I come in? And she threatened to bring a whole bunch of women if they didn't let her in. I remember she was very, very daring. Yeah, so that was not easy for, I think, women at that time as much. It's not like that today, but they were trying to make some breakthroughs.
All right. Okay, so we've hit the halfway point. We're moving on to the third of 4 sections, and this section is on ideology and generational differences. So the main statement is historians have written a lot about what they call the counterculture movement, meaning that your generation rebelled against the values of your parents' generation. And so my first question is, to what extent did people in your social circle see themselves as needing to mobilize for a more just society and a better world?
Well, I would think, my first reaction is that would be the top item in the agenda. You know, we're in the next generation, we're in our 20s. We have a lot of history in our own families, our own culture, in our own country, in our own world. We're in law school. It's all also about, it's supposed to be about the access to justice, to try to get beyond the legality and the formality and history of the law, to look at the gist of the purpose of the law. So if, as the song says, if justice is just us, I think there was a feeling that our generation can come out and make a contribution, not just to enrich how the system works, but how the soul of the system works. So I think that there was a feeling that we could have that opportunity, and we were felt emboldened because we were the first class in Bolton Hall, and it's very historic, and we're in this wonderful University of Ottawa, which is a wonderful university of phenomenal history. There's a lot to be proud of, and it works well with all the other universities and colleges. So the idea of collaboration among academic institutions was inspiring for me, even with the colleges and others. So I think that was it was kind of for some of us, it was a kind of a lofty ambition to come out and do something that would make the general public feel comfortable with not just the legal system, but with lawyers, and that we're not just the butt of lawyers' jokes, but we have some aspirations that are beneficial for society as a whole, to come out with a larger role of thinking, except how much billings do you do every month? And I never once docketed my time in my 47-year history. I never once did that. I always just said, well, here's what I think it would cost, and what can you afford? So I think that's a good question. It sort of brings that out of me anyway.
All right. To what extent did your generation believe that your parents' notions about gender, family, and dating were outdated?
Well, they were not only outdated, they were out of this world. I mean, it was hard to even relate to that thinking. It was like, you can't believe you were actually brought up with people that were like that. But for me, I learned to respect my elders. They came out with another form of upbringing that we have no idea about. And some of them, or most of them, especially in Canada, are from. I mean, Canada is the multicultural society, right? Like the sociologist wrote, the United States is the melting pot. Well, we have in Canada a set of people from around the world. We were, in our generation, we were either the second or third or fourth or fifth generation of immigrants. So we have no idea like what it was like to be brought up in all these other countries, and the rigidity of the cultures and the rules, especially between men and women. And then they come to this society with a whole different set of rules, and trying to get rid of stereotypes that everyone is equal before the law. So I think for me anyway, it was like, yeah, we're distant, but we are inheriting a culture. And I learned eventually from the native people, who always say that whatever we say, do, and think will affect the next 7 generations. So we are the 7th generation of people from the past, and we have no really idea what it was like for them to grow up. So you can't judge, you just can grow and respect the best of what they bring, and realize they were limited. And then we're going to do the same thing for us, being the beginning of the next 7 generations. That's the way I saw it. So it was kind of a balance.
Okay. Did you feel that the political system was democratic, fair, and responsive to citizens' needs at that time?
I don't think it ever has been in history. It never won at that time. I mean, politics is an adversarial system that has its own objectives and agendas. Some people wanted me to go into politics because I couldn't do that. I mean, we need a political system. Sure, we need all sorts of systems, but I kind of became apolitical, even within universities, all the politics in universities in terms of getting, people running for office. But we need the system to create an interaction of different stakeholders. So I kind of respected that. And a lot of them did it for very genuine reasons. Some did it for other reasons, but only God knows the intentions of people. But I felt the politics, not just generally in society, but even in the university, was really difficult to comprehend because the different agendas, even with faculty and other players in the university, all had their own ambitions, which affects your life. It affects how you study, how you graduate, how you get through. I know in one class I said something that was supposed to be funny, but it was caused some political upheaval, and the professor was very upset with me. And I did graduate with cum laude. The only reason I didn't get magna cum laude because this professor wouldn't give me a mark under 70. You have to get a magna cum laude, you got to have an average of whatever, 75, 80 with no mark under 70. He gave me 69, but it was because he politically did not like a comment I made. So I found that even at that level, politics affected fair judgment of people. And if you weren't politically correct, you would have consequences like I did with this professor, who eventually later on apologized to me. But it didn't matter. It was just understanding. I said, well, you had your political position, but why did you bring it into the law class? Like, I had a very valid question. I won't bore you with the question, but it was a valid question. Although it was, as I always do, put it in a kind of a funny context, but it was a valid question. So I don't think it was just politics in society. I think that politics in universities need to be looked at.
Okay. Here, I'm gonna pause my okay. We have 6 minutes left in this Zoom call. So before we move on to the last section, I think let's end this one and start another one, just in case, like I don't expect it to last another while.
Okay.
But
No, yeah, then you can resume this. Okay.
yes. Okay. 1 second. I'm just going to end the recording.